information risk management firm helping clients implement business-first information security and compliance programs. Today, he's going to speak on Test 1 Report Mini, an explanation of how organizations can leverage a pragmatic and rational approach to IT auditing, whereby controls and the associated evidence can be tested once and leveraged across multiple risk management and compliance frameworks. Let's give them a warm welcome.
Green one?
I would assume so. Let's try it.
Let's give this a shot. Okay.
There we go.
All right, perfect. And it's great to be here with everyone in person, not on Zoom. I'm looking forward to not speaking on mute for once. I think I've had more conversations with my dog about cybersecurity than some of my clients. So big shout out to the team at ISACA for making this happen and getting us all out here together. So what I want to talk about today is this concept of test once, report many. And essentially the idea is that organizations who have to comply with multiple frameworks, instead of seeing those frameworks as these very separated, siloed processes, they can create a centralized control set and leverage the testing of that control set and apply it across those frameworks that they need to comply with. So I know this isn't anything new. This is something that's been around for a while, but I think it's something that we've perfected the theory of, but not necessarily the execution. So my goal today is to give you some pragmatic and real tips to hopefully implement this at organizations, or if you're on the external side, help some organizations implement this theory. All right, so quick introduction. Again, my name is Mike Carroll. I'm a manager at Risk 360, and my primary responsibilities at the firm are leading up the HITRUST practice. And why that's relevant is because HITRUST is a framework that's built upon other frameworks. The requirements in the HITRUST CSF or the HITRUST framework map back to one or to multiple compliance frameworks. So it's essentially just a gigantic mapping in and of itself in a lot of ways. In addition to working on HITRUST, I also support our SOC 2 and our ISO service lines. So this is just something that I see quite a bit. I see a lot of opportunity to kind of marry these frameworks together and make the overall audit process much more streamlined and much more efficient. All right, so where we're going, there's really 5 things that I want to touch off on today. So the first one's going to be addressing traditional audit challenges. So when I'm referring to traditional audits, what I'm really referring to, again, is these siloed audits, where if I need to be SOC compliant and PCI compliant and ISO compliant, those are 3 separate assessments, 3 separate audits, 3 separate work streams. So we're going to talk about what are some of the challenges of taking that type of approach, and how does a leveraged approach help reduce some of the cost and some of the burden on us. Secondly, I'm going to talk about some of the common pitfalls. So like I mentioned before, there have been a lot of organizations who have tried to make this theory come to life. Some have done so successfully, but others maybe not so much. And I want to talk about, for the organizations that couldn't make it happen, why weren't they able to? And it really boils down to just a couple of key issues as we look at this. Next thing is best practices for a leveraged approach. So we'll talk about, okay, how do we avoid some of those common pitfalls? And how do we otherwise just make sure that we implement best practices and set ourselves and our organizations up for success? Fourth one is streamlining the process. So a lot of the first couple of bullets are really the theory or showing the value of this type of approach. So under the 4th bullet, I really want to put this in kind of a timeline format and talk about, okay, what are the tasks? What are the milestones? What does this look like pragmatically if I try to implement it? Then the last thing we'll talk about is certification maintenance. So I think at one point or another, everyone in this room has wished that you could just get one compliance framework and be good forever. Unfortunately, that world does not exist. And on an ongoing basis, you're going to have to do some form of assessments and some form of testing. So once we get this all set up, once the planning and preparation are done, once our year 1 audit is done, how do we make sure that we're doing the right things moving forward? So addressing traditional audit challenges, what you'll see is on the left side of the screen, we'll talk about some of the challenges of, again, that siloed approach where everything's its own work stream. On the right side, we'll talk about the solutions, meaning how does a leveraged approach help reduce the burden of some of these? First challenge is that audits are a burden, which may seem weird to hear from someone who's made a career out of external auditing. But it's true, there's a lot of time and effort that goes into these. It's a necessary burden because any organizations who want to work with you need some level of assurance that you're doing the right things to protect their data or to make sure that your system is available. But there's a lot of things that have to be done on the external side. You know, we start with planning as auditors. There's a lot of documentation we have to do. We have to identify, what the audit plan is. How are we going to test everything? What artifacts do we need? Then we go into testing, which usually encompasses some interviews, some walkthroughs, collecting evidence, testing the evidence, then the reporting and the closeout activities. So it can be a lot. That's not all though, because internally organizations have some of these activities they have to complete as well. Normally, they're going to complete their own internal planning. They're going to have control owners who are responsible for providing evidence, conducting those walkthroughs, leading observations. Then they're going to have to go back and forth and collect evidence. And it's not always a clean process. Sometimes there's a lot of back and forth between auditor and the company being audited to arrive at the right artifact. So there's a lot of time that goes into one audit. Now multiply that by 2, 3, 4, basically as many frameworks as you need to comply with, and you can see how it's quickly going to add up. So how does a leveraged approach assist in mitigating some of this time? Well, it lets us have greater efficiencies. So for example, if we're talking about testing a change management process, instead of speaking with the DevOps manager 3 times, I could speak with them once and test one set of change tickets and typically arrive at the same conclusions. Additionally, audit fatigue can be a very real thing. For me on the external side, it's very obvious to me when I'm asking someone for something they just provided, 3 weeks or a couple months ago. It's a very frustrating process. And at times, some of these individuals probably think that the audit's not, much of a value add process or that we're not using time efficiently. So we can help reduce some of the burden on both external and internal parties. The next thing is that, like pretty much anything else in the business, there's a limited budget that can be allocated to the audit process. And when I think about the costs that go into the process, I really put them into 2 buckets, the external and the internal. Now, a lot of people think about the external because it's essentially the sticker price. If I engage an auditor, they're going to give me this fancy statement of work or SOW that identifies the price of the audit. And again, that takes into consideration all of the activities that they do that I mentioned before. But there's also an internal cost to the audit as well. Because if you do a gap assessment and there's gaps and the auditor can't certify you, there's going to be some effort in implementing controls to remediate deficiencies. Additionally, you are, at least in theory, paying your employees. And if you are, you're going to have to pay them to support the audit. Someone has to be in on the interviews. Someone has to sit in on the walkthroughs. Someone has to chase the evidence. So there is also a cost that you're paying them to support these audits. And you can really mitigate both of these costs, internal and external. Internally, again, we're going to need less of our individuals' times if we could just talk to them once instead of multiple times to arrive at the same conclusion. Additionally, we can save external costs because most audit firms will be able to save time and effort on some of these reporting frameworks if you can lump them into one SOW. So they'll receive savings on their time and they'll pass those savings on to you, usually with a pretty significant discount. The third thing that we tend to see is that when you've got these audits that are siloed in nature, the findings tend to be somewhat sporadic. So I'm going to stick with the change management process. So there might be a control where we have to check for approvals documented in change tickets. And as an auditor, we might sample 25 tickets and find out that there weren't sign-offs for 3 of those 25. So that would be an exception. And while it's perfectly legitimate, it's not a very high value add finding. Whereas if I'm looking at this from the perspective of 3 different frameworks and they all kind of see change management a little bit differently, maybe I'll find out that the issue wasn't that we missed 3 sign-offs, but maybe there's a hole in my change management process that needs to be addressed. The 4th bullet here is really just a summary. So as I've laid out, there's a lot of redundancies, a lot of duplicated work when you're not integrating these workflows. So if you're able to integrate them, you kind of have this single source of truth where instead of focusing on just the requirements, the primary focus is now on my control set. So I've got that single source of truth, and somewhat naturally, the focus becomes on security and compliance just becomes the byproduct. So common pitfalls, like I had mentioned, some organizations have been unsuccessful in deploying this methodology. So I wanted to talk through why. So the first, and I would say most prevalent thing that we see is a reliance on publicly available mappings. So what I'm talking about here is if you want to map your SOC and your PCI frameworks, you can do a quick Google search and you'll quickly be greeted by a number of mappings. Now, the issue with these mappings is that they map requirement to requirement, and that forces you to make an assumption about the control that's in place to satisfy those requirements. Now, some requirements, it's fairly straightforward and easy to do that, but for others, there's multiple controls that could potentially satisfy the requirement. And if I guess wrong, my mapping falls apart pretty quickly. So I'm not saying these are all bad. It can be a good starting point, but you do want to make sure that you have some process in place to really put the focus on the control and make sure that you've got the right control identified. Next thing is miscommunication between organizations being audited and their auditors. If you create this great mapping and map all of your requirements together for 2 or 3 different frameworks, but don't explain the strategy or what you're doing to your auditor, when it comes time for the external audit, they're not going to know how to realize those efficiencies, so the wheels fall off pretty quickly. So I'd recommend, and I'll get into this in a little bit, but as a best practice, bring your assessor into this conversation as early as possible. They can help guide you on the strategy, and they can make sure that they identify the right evidence and controls so that once the external audit rolls around, they're testing the right things and both parties are on the same page. The third is lack of consistency between policies and procedures. So under a typical governance structure, what we'll see is that policies are set at a high corporate level. And then as we go throughout the organization at a more granular level, we'll have standards or procedures. So what that means is that the procedures that are lower level might be a little bit different for each business unit or each department or each application, but they all roll up under the same objectives. If we don't have that consistency across the organization, an auditor isn't going to be able to leverage their testing from Department A if Department B is doing something entirely different. The fourth thing is a failure to keep mappings updated. So the frameworks themselves change, usually at varying rates. You've got something like ISO 27001, which hasn't been updated since 2013, but you also have frameworks like HITRUST that are updated at least annually, sometimes more. If you don't update your mappings as those frameworks change, it quickly becomes inaccurate and therefore irrelevant. So make sure that you're keeping a close eye on when the frameworks change and that you update your mappings as they do. The last thing is lack of scope alignment. And what I mean here is if I've got a SOC report that covers system A and I've got a PCI report that covers system B, I'm not going to be able to effectively map them together because the system specific controls won't align. That's not to say that there's nothing that can be aligned. Maybe some of the HR controls or governance or some of the policies can be mapped, but you're losing out on a lot of those system specific controls that we're trying to map together. All right, so the next topic is best practices for a leveraged approach. So the first thing, and I would say this applies to virtually anything in your organization, is to get leadership buy-in. So this should be one of the first conversations that you have. Make sure that they understand the value proposition and the overall strategy, basically why you want to implement this approach. If leadership doesn't buy in, if they're not pushing this message down, it's going to be very difficult to get traction. So make sure that you communicate the overall value of this, if you can, in terms of cost savings that'll impact the bottom line, and make sure that they're on the same page and buy into this. Next thing is governance structure. We talked about this a bit with the policies and procedures, but where this is also relevant is for companies that are regularly completing mergers and acquisitions. Because what commonly happens is if I acquire a company and I don't have a clean onboarding process, they might be doing things the way they used to under their previous governance structure. So I want to make sure that my governance structure is consistent, and that especially if I'm onboarding organizations, that they're subject to that process and that they comply with our policies. Third, select the appropriate frameworks. And I would say most organizations are good at this, but for some, not so much. And if you want to comply with the framework, it should do one of three things for you. It should help with revenue generation, cost containment, or risk mitigation. If it's not doing one of those three things, you should probably take a step back and ask yourself, why am I pursuing this? The reason being that the more frameworks that you have to comply with, the more complex your mapping will be and the more costly it'll be. So you want to make sure that if you're actually pursuing a framework, there's a valid business justification behind that. Fourth, I talked about a bit, again, align scope, but I put a star next to this saying where possible. And the reason is there might be cases where it doesn't make sense to align your scope. Common example is for a PCI report, you generally want to limit your scope to just the cardholder data environment or the CDE. So if that's the case, and for any reason you want to limit your scope for a certain framework, it might make sense to do so, but I would say generally as a best practice, try to align your scope as quickly as possible, or as closely as possible, excuse me. Next point is align your testing periods. So if I'm trying to map SOC 2 and ISO together, but my SOC 2 testing is done in June and my ISO is in December, I'm not going to be able to map them because my SOC evidence will be stale by the time I get to the ISO audit. Another pointer here is to be aware of the difference between point in time audits versus audits occurring over a period of time. So a common example might be a SOC 2 type 2 occurs over a period of time. Maybe we look at the controls from January 1st through the end of December. But you have reports like ISO that are a point in time where you might state, as of December 31st, these controls were in place and functional. So if that's the case, I would try to align my testing periods where I've got that calendar year for SOC and ISO is as of December 31st. That way I can make sure that most of my testing is done in late December, early January timeframe. The next point here, and if you walk away from this with anything, it's this: create your mapping at the control level. Take your focus off of the requirements once you have that standardized control set, and your focus should be on the controls. So if I envision a mapping in Excel, my far left column should be my centralized control set. And as I go to the right, I'm naming the different frameworks and the different requirements that I'm going to comply with. Next thing is training and knowledge sharing. So we talked about kind of relaying this message with leadership, but you also want to make sure that the system owners or the control owners, the people responsible for pulling the evidence, are on the same page. That way they're not surprised once the external auditors roll on site. And secondly, this is a good opportunity for you to tell them that you're trying to save them time. It'll be greatly appreciated. So I highly recommend doing this. And the last one is using one assessor tends to be a best practice here. Now, I will say there are some reasons for using two assessors. The most common reason is that assessors see things a little bit differently. So assessor A might catch something that assessor B might not, which can mitigate my risk. But again, when you want a leveraged approach to work for your organization, consistency is key. And auditors have this idea of auditor judgment, which basically means that they can do what they need to gain assurance that a control is functioning. So if auditor A wants to test a control using an observation, but B wants to use an inspection, or if A wants to look at document ABC and auditor B wants to look at XYZ, there's not going to be consistency there and my mapping won't work as well as intended. So I highly recommend just using one assessor if that makes sense for your business. So the next thing here is streamlining the process. So again, a lot of what we talked about before was just some of the pitfalls and best practices, but I really wanted to give an idea of, in a timeline, what does this look like? So keep in mind that the bulk of your time is going to be spent in preparation and planning. You're basically building this foundation that's going to live on for years to come. So the first thing is to select the appropriate frameworks, the time periods, as well as the scope of our assessments. I talked again about making sure that there's as much consistency in this as possible to make sure that your approach flows as smoothly as it can. The next thing, I know I kind of mix and match those, is to develop your master control listing, but I'd recommend just starting with which framework you feel you align closest to. For most clients, this tends to be ISO 27001 or NIST 853. But again, if we're in Excel, far left column is going to be controls, and the next column over is going to be which framework I identify closest with. Now, if you want, you can actually complete your mapping at this stage in the game. You just keep going to the right and adding the additional frameworks and the additional requirements to the right of that first framework. So keep in mind, once you're done, you should have a master control list, and each control will map to one or potentially to multiple requirements from these frameworks that you want to comply with. The next two things are around documenting how you're going to pull this evidence. So the first thing is documenting the evidence requests. Basically, what do we need to prove that this control is in place for our auditor? And the next one is documenting our control owner. So once the auditor rolls around, who's going to be responsible for pulling this evidence or conducting interviews? Again, I'd make sure that you bring your auditor into the loop as quickly as possible. That way they're helping you identify these evidence requests that they're going to be looking for. And to recommend, don't just document the control owner's name, but make sure that you formally explain their roles and responsibilities as well. I talked about the control mapping already, so we can skip over that for now. If you're not comfortable doing that off the bat, you can do it after you've done all of those steps just for one framework. So the next things that we're going to do are maybe for a little bit more mature of an organization. The first one is making sure that you store your evidence in a secure repository. And this will look a little bit different for each business. For some, it's just a shared drive. Maybe it's SharePoint or G Suite, something like that. Others may use a GRC tool because there's plenty on the market. And a third option is, depending on your assessor firm, they might be able to offer a platform where you can store that data. And the next point here is around continuous monitoring. And I know this is a bit of a buzzword in the industry today, but when I think of continuous monitoring, I think of it as taking the onus on yourself to perform your own internal testing. Don't just wait for the auditors to tell you there's a gap, but take the initiative yourself to do testing, maybe quarterly or monthly. Make sure that your controls are functioning as they should be, and that you can provide evidence indicating that. It really serves two purposes. First one, which I would say is most important, is it mitigates risk. So controls are designed to mitigate risk, and if they're not functioning as they should be, then you have a higher risk to your organization. If you can identify issues as quick or as close to the source as possible, you can mitigate that risk to your organization. But secondly, you'll often have cleaner reports because, again, if we identify those issues as quickly as we can and remediate them, it's going to be less findings that show up on my report. And the last part here is, if you have the technological capabilities, leverage automation to help you in this process. And an example at Risk 360 is that we have this GRC platform that we built in-house called Phalanx. And one of the nice things about Phalanx is that it aids us with this mapping. So for instance, if we have a client who was previously doing SOC 2 and they later add in ISO, Phalanx will automatically use AI on the back end to suggest artifacts from that SOC 2 report that can meet the ISO requirements. Now, I recommend having a manual intervention here. You don't just want to rely on machine learning just in case there's an error. So make sure that you've got someone validating that the evidence being proposed is actually sufficient. And the last thing I want to talk through is certification maintenance. Again, this isn't just a year one activity, but you have to comply with these frameworks year after year. So you want to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success on a go forward basis. So the first thing is make evidence collection a habit. Again, along with continuous monitoring, make sure that we're checking up on our controls, that they're functioning as they should, that we're mitigating risk. Next part, excuse me, be aware of the different reporting cadences of the frameworks. So for instance, a SOC 2 Type 2 report is generally good for a period of about 1 year, meaning that every year you have to retest all of the controls. However, take something like HITRUST or like ISO, and they build in these concepts of surveillance audits or interim assessments. What that means is you don't have to retest every control every year. There's off years where you just have to test a sample of those requirements. So at a bare minimum, make sure that you're testing the controls that you need to on an ongoing basis. But as a best practice, I'd recommend testing your entire control set on an annual basis. Just because, like we talked about, risk mitigation is the goal, compliance is just a byproduct. And the last thing is make sure that as the frameworks change, that you're closely monitoring that and that you're updating your frameworks or that you're updating your mapping as they do change. That will save you a lot of headaches once the external audit rolls around, and make sure that your mapping stays as accurate as possible. So that's it for me. Are there any questions from the audience? We do have some free shirts. So Jess is up front. If you want to talk to us, definitely feel free. We have clothing available, which is great. I do know I am the one thing standing between all of you and dinner, so I understand if you have to run.
Hi, Michael. This is JC. We just checked the online audience. There are no questions online. Are there any questions in the room? No questions in the room. This was a fabulous, I do mean fabulous presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.